Our first speaker today is Tom Mellin. Tom is the remote sensing coordinator for the Forest Service Southwestern Region, and since 2010 has also served as the agency's National Infrared Program Manager. He supports fire as an infrared interpreter and a National Infrared Coordinator, and has been employed by the Forest Service for nearly 20 years. Today, Tom is going to present about National Infrared Operations, Workflows, and Data. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring up my presentation and look for confirmation from somebody that they can see it.
Looks good, Tom.
And hide the control panel. Okay, great. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this group of people who probably use our products quite a bit, but I've never had the opportunity to address directly. So thanks to Dan and some other people for getting me on this agenda. So I'm going to talk about National Infrared Operations, or as you've probably heard it called, NIROPS or NIROPS. And some of these slides I'm going to go through very quickly, but my understanding is they're all going to be made available later, so you'll have time to look at them with a little more detail. Our NIROPS platforms and systems consist of 2 Forest Service aircraft, our Cessna Citation jet and our King Air 200. We have 3 Phoenix imaging systems, 1 in each plane and another one used for testing and development in the shop. They're dual band systems. We have a fire detection band as well as a background terrain band. And it's a line scanner, which means it has a very wide field of view. At our typical flying height of 10,000 feet above ground, we're covering a 6-mile swath. And the imagery is ortho-corrected on board and pushed off via the air cell system. What this means is we can cover a lot of ground quickly. With our given overlaps, we can easily image 300,000 acres per hour, or even more if we fly at a higher elevation. Basically, our capabilities are we can detect from 14,000 feet a 6-inch hotspot, open flame, in level terrain and with no forest cover. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The planes are national resources, so it's the service that the incident orders. They don't get the actual plane, and everything is coordinated at the national level out of NIC. Our 4 standard products are our shape files, which delineate the current heat perimeter as well as areas of intense heat, scattered heat, and isolated heat sources, a GeoPDF map, a KMZ, and the one I want to particularly draw people's attention to because I think some people aren't aware of it or never bother to check it is the infrared interpreter's log. And that serves as kind of a briefing on what the interpreter did or didn't see in the imagery. Particularly important because if there are areas of heavy cloud cover or maybe for a given night, not every fire in a complex was flown, that information will be in this log and you wouldn't get that from just the shape file. Our infrared interpreters all work remote. As I said, the imagery is processed on board the plane, pushed off via the air cell system to the FTP site. Interpreters working at the remote location, typically their home unit, map, create the products, and post them back up to the FTP site. And this is just our 2017 NIROPS request, which was a record-breaking year for us, but I direct your attention particularly to that chart, which goes back to 2006. The red bars being the total number of requests submitted and the blue being the total number that we were actually able to fly. The UTF rate last year was 28%. UTF, of course, means unable to fill. And when you take out the UTFs due to weather, our non-weather UTF rate was 21%. We'll talk about the prioritization and why certain fires don't get flown a little bit later. But the key thing to take away from this is look at 2015 and 2017. You know, 2015 was our record year, and that only lasted for 2 years. So we're seeing a big increase. When we do that prioritization, of course, as you would expect, the Type 1 and Type 2 fires have greater priority, and you can see that reflected when you look at the non-weather UTF rate by the type of team that's on a particular fire. Last year, even with all our problems, the UTF rate for Type 1 fires was managed to hold it to 15% and 17% for the Type 2 fires. And you see how it goes up for the Type 3. The other is the smaller, either Type 4 or local unit fires. Here's just a graph of the number of requests coming in through the season. We have the blue box shows when the infrared desk, National Infrared Desk at NIC is activated, and I or one of a number of other people who are red carded as IRCNs will be up there. The interesting thing is before 2015, it was very rare for us to get more than 30 orders a night. It maybe happened once or twice in a really busy year. In 2015, we hit a record of 63 orders per night, and last year we had 2 nights of 69 orders. So really unprecedented demand. Just an example, our busiest night last year, we were able to cover 48 fires. And when I say fire, that's just a given order on the NIROPS site. That can mean multiple boxes within the order or multiple fires as part of a complex. And there were, I think, about 58 orders that particular night. This is just the AFF tracking output for our King Air B200 and what it covers. It can fly longer without refueling, so sometimes we tend to give it those big complex fires with huge boxes like in Northern California. Here's our jet, which can fly much faster in between the fires. So a lot of times that's the plane we're going to send out to Florida and Georgia where we started off the season, and some of our more dispersed fires. The real key things I want people to keep in mind, this audience here, is that in almost all cases, unless you're on the far tail ends of a season, the infrared interpreters are usually working multiple fires. And the IRNs are trained to map heat that is visible in the imagery. They're not F-bands, so they're not going to make a call and draw a perimeter unless there's enough residual heat there for them to draw that line. So this can create some issues when, for example, the first infrared flight is ordered a week in or a week after the fire started. They may not be able to create the full perimeter if there is no existing information in either WFDS or on the FTP site. The same issue can come up if a fire is only flown intermittently and a week goes by and the fire has grown. If no additional perimeter is posted for them to work off of, their fallback is always to map the heat and not necessarily put a ring around the entire, what in fact was the entire fire. Now that information usually should be discussed in the log if the interpreter's having to do that. Another thing to keep in mind is IRCs through smoke but not clouds. So another good reason to check that log and see if cloud cover was an issue on a particular flight. And especially, we've talked about the log, getting down to the information loop. You know, it's a continuous feedback between the perimeters that the interpreter is creating from the imagery and the additional updates to the perimeter they're getting from the incident. And that feedback loop is usually pretty good for the type 1 and type 2 fires. Where we sometimes see it fall apart is for the smaller fires. We don't always see a contact name, email, and phone number on the scanner order, and it's really important for whoever is wanting this product and ordering this product to put that in there, not just the dispatch number. And if there is any kind of additional updates to the perimeter, to let the interpreter know that that is either posted to the FTP site or maybe it's been updated in WFDS, because they count on that as their starting point for a given night's interpretation. And the last thing I want to mention here is that NIROPS is not the best tool at the end of a fire. As I mentioned, we fly at about 10,000 feet AGL. We can detect those 6-inch hotspots, but that's in flat terrain and open terrain. Now, if you add in forest cover and, you know, the crazy topography slopes we sometimes have on a lot of these fires, what we can see at 2 in the morning from 10,000 feet is not going to be what a fixed wing or rotary wing with a FLIR ball can see 400 feet off the ground looking in off nadir. So we don't really recommend it. We understand our ability to cover a large area, but the absence of any isolated heat in a NIROPS flight does not mean on the ground you're not going to see smokes and small fires. Just keep that in mind. As far as the scheduling, our flight schedule for a given night is usually set by about 1900 Mountain Time. And that's when the crew will go through, and any fires that couldn't be scheduled to be flown will be UTF'd, and an auto email will go out to the incident contact if there is an email entered for that particular order. The schedule can and does change nightly. Our planes don't work out of a fixed base. They're literally coming on shift at 2 Mountain Time every day, looking at the number of orders. There might be new fires in there and figuring out where they're going to end up that night. In addition, sometimes they'll get in a kind of schedule where they're going back and forth between two places, say Boise and Bellingham. And what that means is if your fire is closer to the ends of one of those runs, on a given night, you may be one of the first fires flown and get your products very early. On the following night, you may be one of the last fires flown and get your products late. Our interpreters make every effort to post the products by 4:30 Mountain Time because we know that there are a lot of people looking for that to put on morning maps, but they can't always make it. Sometimes the plane isn't landing until 4 in the morning, and if you're one of the last fires to get that imagery pushed off and get your data, that time cutoff will not be met. And the interpreters are talking to the situation unit leaders or the GISSs to make them aware of this. The priority for missions carries over to the delivery of products. If an interpreter is supporting multiple incidents, they're almost always going to work on the Type 1 or Type 2 fires first and then deliver the Type 3 or 4 fires last. So how is it decided? Before we get in what fires are going to be flown, before we get into that, I want to give you an example of how the UTFs are unable to fills break down. And I'm showing you 2 years here. 2016 was closer to what had been an average year for us. And in those years, typically half or most of our, or a majority of our UTFs are due to weather. Again, when the monsoons come in or at the end of the season up north, we just can't see through the clouds, so that's the cause of a lot of UTFs. 2016, we had a 10% UTF rate, only 4% non-weather. But when we get years with so much demand like 2017, we also had aircraft and mechanical issues. You can see how the UTF rate goes up and the percentage of UTFs due to weather goes down. So we actually had more UTFs due to mechanical issues with the aircraft, followed by weather and very closely duty day restrictions. This is a list. I'm not going to read through all of it. Pretty common sense, a lot of it, as to the prioritization of fires for infrared coverage. The one I do have starred is sometimes what people don't always consider is the geographic location and grouping of fires. That's why sometimes there will be Type 2 fires not flown when a Type 3 or Type 4 fire is flown. And it's because the Type 3 or Type 4 fires are close to other fires we have to fly, and they can pick those up with a minimal amount of scan time and deviating from their flight path. The ones that are more geographically dispersed are the ones that can be picked up maybe by other assets, or if the decision is made that we have to cover those, other fires are going to drop off the list. So what are the reasons, some of the reasons for this unprecedented demand? Part of it is we know the fire seasons are hotter, lasting longer. Another is we've seen an increased reliance on infrared as more fires are managed with a combined strategy, suppression and monitor and confine. So this is from 2017. These were our top 10 incidents. Anybody who was in the Northern Rockies isn't surprised to see how many of those are in Montana. And this is not number of requests. This is number of actual missions flown. The highest was Lolo Peak with 52 flights. In 2016, we did 75 flights over the Soberanes fire and 60 flights over the Pioneer. In addition, what we're seeing in 2015, in the last 3 years basically, the Type 3 and smaller fires have been making up 38 to 44% of the IR orders. And I think a lot of that's what's driving the huge spike. We previously weren't used as much for that. So that is something we're definitely seeing. And of course, in the prioritization, they're the ones that are more likely to be UTF. Going back to that earlier slide, the UTF rate for those non-weather was 28% or so. This is just a list of all the people involved. I'm not going to spend much time talking on that. Just know that there are a lot of people that come together to make this all happen. And our main takeaways from 2017 is really unprecedented demand. Combine that with the fact that our planes are getting old. Our King Air is 33 years old. We've had to have parts machined because we could no longer find them on the market. We're also working with Nick and the GACs and the incidents to discuss when best to utilize other IR resources like the Colorado MMA and the DRTI, Distributed Real-Time Infrared, also known as the Dirty Bird. Particularly useful for small fires, initial attack, the early stages, or if you're trying to cover a wide area for hot spot. And obviously, they're capable of daytime flights, which NIROPS in its current configuration, we pretty much fly at night to increase for maximum efficiency, basically. And what we found out this past year is those other IR resources are complementary to NIROPS, but they're not going to replace our capacity and product. So if one of our planes is down for any reason, any of those that I mentioned previously can't really pick up and take on the 15 or 16 fires that one of our planes is flying. And I want to end with questions here. This is an image from the first night that we flew the fires in Sonoma and Napa County out in California. There's Santa Rosa over there on the west side and Napa down here. So at that point, I'd like to open it up for questions. How are we going to do that, Diane?
Well, let's go ahead and Morgan and I will be fielding the attendees for questions. Attendees can raise their hand in the GoToWebinar, and we can call on them, unmute them, and they can speak the question verbally, or they can post their question into the chat box. So we'll give it a moment, and we'll see if we get some questions.
Okay, Tom, we do have a couple questions in the chat box. The first one is from Gary Curcio. He says, can we have acreage ID for each type of heat? It would be valuable for smoke and emissions modeling.
The reason we have not done that is because that is a judgment call by individual interpreters. It's not something that has a set definition. When we say intense heat and scattered heat, these are just geographical concentrations of heat. And it varies from interpreter to interpreter to some extent, and quite honestly, it also varies according to the size of the fire and the amount of time that the interpreter has to produce the product. As always, you have lumpers versus splitters, but people tend to become lumpers when they're trying to get a large fire done in an hour to meet the posting time so that the incident can use it.
Okay, next question we have from Robin Heffernan. She says, do analysts use other remote sensing data available, such as satellite data, to make a call when signals to make a call with signals that are unclear?
Typically not, with one exception I'll talk about, because what they have close to real time or at the same time as our flights may be some of the satellite, the images like MODIS and VIIRS, but that their spatial resolution, it's not commensurate with what NIROPS has. One thing some interpreters do is they've used Landsat or other satellite imagery to go back, for example, in areas of grass fires or areas where they didn't have any heat in the NIROPS imagery, and delineate where the fire actually burned. But because that imagery usually has an absolute minimum of 24 hours before it's posted, that would be kind of an after the fact thing. They wouldn't be incorporated in a given night's products that are posted. Any other questions?
Yep, we have quite a few. So the next is from Karen Riley. She said, you mentioned a log. Are we able to see that in WFDS, and if so, where?
No, the interpreters post all their products to the NIST FTP site. Within the incident folder, there is, at the same level directly below the incident folder and the same level as the GIS folder, there is an IR folder. And for it'll have the date of the morning briefing that the IR is for, and every one of those folders will include the zip file with the shape files, the GeoPDF map, the KMZ, and the log.
Okay, thanks. We've got one from Derek Williams. Any possibility of UAVs in the future?
Yeah, I believe our next speaker will point out that the future is already here. For the NIROPS program, no. Now, as part of the whole integrated suite of IR sensing products, yes, that's already here. But for the National Infrared Operations, you know, our focus is on these fires that can cover, you know, multiple GACs and 15 plus fires in a night. And those type of UAVs, then you're talking about the really, really very expensive ones that only the military and the National Guard typically have access to.
Okay, Nancy Veras asks, can you address the replacement of aging equipment?
Yeah, so there's two issues. One is the scanners. Our line scanners, the basic frame and technology has been around for a while, but it's important to note that all the components have been upgraded significantly. Every year they're putting in new motherboards, new scan heads. So the scan equipment itself is actually very up to date. The planes, we are hoping. There was recently a Forest Service contract let for purchasing one King Air, I believe it was a 250, with the option of maybe up to 24. And one of the things in the contract was potential uses for infrared. But obviously with planes this old, that's something that's going to have to be addressed soon. And there are people looking at that.
Okay, we have a question from John Reek. Actually, he's got two, so I'll read them together. What can you tell us about Aircraft 3? It seems the products delivered when Aircraft 3 is utilized are not on par with products from the NIROPS platform. And then second, he has Aircraft 3 seems like it's not as accurate.
So the Aircraft 3 name is really a catch-all term for assets from the DoD side that we can sometimes make use of when our planes are maxed out or one of our planes are down. And we've worked with them over the years to develop products as similar as possible to the NIROPS products. So you still get the shape files, you get a GeoPDF, you get some semblance of a log. The difference is the incident can't have any and will not have any direct contact with the analysts doing this on the DoD side. As far as the accuracy, I would say there's a number of things that can affect the accuracy. There are cases where it is extremely accurate, and there are cases where there might be impacts to the accuracy of those products. We do everything we can to minimize them, but you know, that's about all I can say.
Okay, we're getting close to the time allotted. Let's take one more question, and then I see we still have some. We can move them to the end of the webinar. So the last one here is, are there examples of products one would receive from other resources such as FLIR, DRTI, etc.? If so, where? And that question's from Justin Sharp.
There are examples. Since I don't tend to track that, I know that on some fires now, with both the Colorado MMA, and I've seen this with some vendors like VETS, is when you look in that IR folder on an incident, you'll see our standard folders, and then you might see a folder that says MMA or VETS. And so that, if you know of an incident where those were used, you may be able to see some of that. I think one of the things that they're working on is, especially with the Colorado MMA, is to kind of standardize the products so people know what to expect. But there are a range of products from KMZs to video, and I know the video from the MMA can be posted within the EGP. But again, that's not my program, so I don't know of a standard place where everything is posted similar to what we do with all our products.